From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. It is Election Day, finally, and here with analysis of what to expect during the day, I am here with Matthew Continetti, journalist, author, and a fellow at the esteemed American Enterprise Institute. Matthew, thank you so much for being here. It's the big day, Election Day, the day everyone has been slogging toward for more than a year now. And I'd love to spend some time, you are a keen observer of politics, go through with you where this race has ended in terms of the candidates and what we might expect as the results start to roll in. You wrote a really compelling piece a few days ago. And first of all, I want to congratulate you. The title of it was The Trump Flex. And my teenage daughters gave me a long lecture not long ago about how I never used that word correctly. And I think you did. So congratulations on that. But you went through the reasons either side would win if they do. And on Trump's side, you noted that he's run a very bold campaign, one that is witnessed in these iconic images, whether it be from the assassination attempt all the way down to the reflective vest garbage truck moment that we had just last week, which, by the way, I think is something that gets forgotten in too much of the negative media coverage of him, that he is running ahead of his polls from 2016 and 2020. He's more popular than ever. His coalition is broader than it has been in the past. And you put this down to the fact that, if I'm reading correctly, that Americans want change, and he seems to be one that has not been afraid to lean into that message. Explain a little bit more his closing argument and how you think it's resonating out there.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Kim. I think if there's one number that really dominates this election, it's the right track, wrong track number. And you have a situation where 2-1 Americans think that the country is on the wrong track. And when the number has reached this level in past elections, we've had a change in government. There are other data points that show that the country is looking for change. If you ask, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Most Americans say they are not better off. In fact, the number of Americans who say they're not better off today than they were 4 years ago is at about the same level as it was in, say, 1992, when again the incumbent government lost. So I think the dissatisfaction with the state of the country, with the change in the price level since Joe Biden took office, with the state of the southern border, with the fact that there's just a sense of disorder abroad for sure, but also I think a sense of disorder at home, including some of these messages that a lot of people have been seeing in the Trump ads about trans issues. All of that suggests to me that Trump has had a very good few weeks in this campaign. And stepping back, this dissatisfaction, this desire for change has been there from the beginning. And what's kind of funny about this race is it was always close, and it's gotten closer in the final days. And if the polls are right, I mean, we are in for a squeaker.
Yeah, well, we're going to delve into that question. Are the polls right? But would you agree with the sentiment? The thing that strikes me, really jumps out based on everything you just said, is in times past when you have had a country that is this dissatisfied with the direction of the country. I'm thinking back, for instance, to the Carter-Reagan election. What does it mean that this race is still so close, given that the Democratic candidate here is clearly a continuation of Joe Biden and the policies that many people feel are the issue? Well,
I think that's a great question. I think it says a few things. The first is that this is a closely divided country, and the partisan division in this country, it has been very narrow and very entrenched for about 30 years. And you can go back, and my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Barone, coined the phrase, the 49% nation. Well, that was to describe the 2000 election, which was a quarter of a century ago. And yet here we are, and we're looking at these final polls and these final polling averages, and we're still in the 49% nation. When you have a country that's this divided, it's often the case that the two sides often perceive different realities. And so for Republican voters and Republican-leaning voters, they're looking at the state of the world. They're looking at the increase in the grocery bill over the past 4 years. They're looking at the border But for Democratic voters and Democratic leaners, well, they're looking at, say, abortion rights since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. And of course, they're looking at the personality and conduct of former President Trump. And so I think that kind of explains it, an entrenched partisan division, and then also the polarization around Donald Trump's personality. It's very rare to have a leader that has been at the center of politics for so long, and yet we are as divided over Donald Trump, the man, and many of his policies, though not all of them, as we were almost now 9 years ago.
Well, that gets to her closing message, very much to her closing message. And you noted in this piece that if she were to win, it would be because Trump's confidence in this election has led him to ignore some really important voting groups that look to be coming together to possibly be her juggernaut if she were to win, to bring her over the finish line. And obviously, those groups are women and also suburban independents and Republicans who you note are uneasy with Trump's personality. What might he have done differently on this campaign trail to have appealed to those voters? Or is his personality just such that this was an impassable hurdle?
Well, I don't think Donald Trump is going to change as a person. But I do think there have been some decisions made in the second half of the campaign since Joe Biden withdrew from the election, that if Trump loses, many observers will go back and say maybe things could have gone differently in order to appeal to groups like that you mentioned, like women voters, like the suburban independent voters. The first thing is the selection of Donald Trump's running mate. J.D. Vance from Ohio is clearly a pick that's meant to set up MAGA as the dominant ideology or framework for Republican politics, not just in 2028 when Donald Trump is term limited from running again, but beyond. Another decision that was made was the decision to keep Nikki Haley on the sidelines throughout this final part of the campaign. Nikki Haley had an article in the Journal this week, but really she has not stumped with Trump. And she did appear briefly at the Republican convention. But again, the decision was not to pursue that type of campaign where you're trying more persuasion than mobilization. And I do think just in the last week with the Madison Square Garden rally, that again was fan service. It was meant to demonstrate that Donald Trump and his supporters are one. They're part of this movement. There's a great energy and indeed, I'll use the word joy that comes from being a part of MAGA. But for many people who aren't part of that movement, they sometimes get a little bit leery of it. So I think you could look at those three distinct moments as decision points in this campaign. It's been a very confident campaign. That confidence is continuing into the final hours now. And I think the confidence has some data behind it. But I also think we could wake up in the days ahead and say, maybe things could have gone a little bit differently.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, more on this election day and what to expect. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel, and I am here with Matthew Continetti of AEI. Here's one that has stumped me. I've been trying to think it through. So we've talked about what he did right. We've talked about, you just mentioned, and I agree with you entirely, some decisions he made that I don't think helped him as much as they might have if he'd have gone a different way. We've talked about her problems. One of the biggest ones that hasn't necessarily been mentioned, but her failure to break in any way with Joe Biden and an agenda that has clearly proven very unpopular with the country. But here's the one that's been on my mind. What has she done right in this campaign? What do we think her strengths have been? If she wins, what is it that it was because she did correctly?
Well, I think the one thing she did right in this campaign is lock up the Democratic nomination very rapidly. You know, it wasn't a done deal. If we kind of take a trip down memory lane, it's true that about a half hour after he announced he was withdrawing from the race, President Biden endorsed Kamala Harris. But let's not forget that some key figures, most notably former President Obama, took their time in endorsing Harris. And she was very, I think, shrewd in locking up support among the delegates she needed for the nomination very quickly. And indeed, I think some of the reporting that will happen will show that she was quietly at work at that project even before Biden made his withdrawal public. So that, I think, was her main achievement in this campaign. The other achievement has been she's been able to coast on this message that is gossamer thin, but she is a welcoming presence, a warm presence. Her voice has a very nice timbre, and she's been able to generate a considerable amount of enthusiasm at these rallies, especially in the home stretch, that I wouldn't think possible for a candidate who will not comment on the issues, has no real agenda, and has made several errors. You know, you spoke of failing to define herself vis-a-vis Biden. I do think that will be one of the signal moments in the campaign if she loses that exchange on The View, the talk show, where when asked if there was anything she would have done differently than Biden, Harris said, not a thing comes to mind.
Amazing.
It's just amazing.
Well, let's turn to those polls. As people are out there already, well, one thing too, enormous numbers of people have already returned their ballots or voted in person. That's been quite striking. We're going to touch on that, but just quick line, because you mentioned it on the polls. If you go and you look at the Real Clear Politics average right now, both the national polls and the battleground averages, Trump is winning both of those averages. If you drill down into the states, he's up 2.5 to 3 points in Arizona, 2 points in Georgia, nearly 2 points in North Carolina. The only states he's not ahead in those averages on Real Clear Politics are Michigan and Wisconsin, where she is slightly leading in the averages. But the comparison here is really striking. If you go back and look at where things were this day, 4 years ago, Joe Biden was 6.9 points ahead in those averages, the national polling average on Real Clear Politics. Clinton in 2016 was 3.2. Obviously, Biden won, but barely. Clinton, of course, lost. Do you think the polls are more accurate this year? How are you looking at them? And what should we take from the fact? I know there's a lot of Republicans that are banking that, you know, this just means Trump's got it in the bag because they always underestimate him. I'm not so sure this time around.
Right. Well, there is this historical pattern where pollsters seem to be able to get the Democratic vote share right, but they miss the Republican vote share and they miss the Trump vote share in the 16 and 20 elections. You have to ask why. Well, the reason that's been suggested that I find plausible is that a lot of Trump voters just don't participate in polls. Polling is one of those institutions that many Trump voters believe is corrupt and they don't want to engage. Whereas a liberal voter who is very pro-Kamala, if you've met any such voters, you know they are very eager to tell you why they're supporting Kamala Harris and why Donald Trump would be a terrible decision for the country. So I do think the shy Trump voter or the kind of skeptical Trump voter is still out there and perhaps not being fully captured by the polls. At the same time, polling can err in two ways. In 2022, the midterm election, the polls misjudged the Democratic performance ahead of the election. So I think one of the more important graphics of this campaign was put up by the election analyst Nate Cohn, where he said, look, if the polls err in a way that they did in 2016 or 2020, Donald Trump will win every single swing state. However, if they err in the way that they did in 2022, well, then it's a very competitive election with a possible Harris edge. And that's led people like me, you know, professional journalists and commentators who are supposed to have opinions and predictions, completely befuddled. And I'm in this position where I really don't know who's going to win. But I will say, if you look at the fundamentals of the campaign, you would think that Trump would normally have an edge.
Yeah, see, I am befuddled too. And I want to run this by you as well. As we get to the end of today or tomorrow, as the votes come in, isn't it also possible, because this is the thing that's messing with my head, that the polls are missing something entirely and that there's going to be a big win one way or the other? I still don't think that's out of the realm of possibilities, because you see this different data coming in and it kind of doesn't jibe with polls suggesting this is on a knife's edge. And I'm talking here about some data from both sides, by the way, too. On the one hand, you've got this surge in voter registration numbers toward Republicans in recent years. You've had this recent Gallup poll where for the first time in a very long time, more Americans are identifying as Republicans rather than as Democrats. You've got these sort of early voting stats that suggest Republicans are deeply cutting into, if not reversing, the advantages that Democrats had in early voting in some of the swing states. At the same time, you've got, and this is one that sticks out in my head, in Pennsylvania, they're looking at early voters, and obviously those come back by registration. Democrats have continued to do a lot better than Republicans in that early vote in Pennsylvania. But what's striking is the number of new voters who, by the way, are Democratic women. Or you get this Iowa poll, from Ann Seltzer saying Kamala Harris is winning Iowa by 4 points. I mean, do you feel all of this is adding up? And what's the potential for some big election one way or the other?
I think that's definitely a possibility. I mean, if the Ann Seltzer poll of Iowa, which shows Harris ahead, is accurate, well, then I think it will be an early night for Harris. Yeah. I think she'll do very well. I happen to think that poll is an outlier, but if it's true, it'd be a very good night for Kamala Harris. You mentioned the voter ID numbers and the Republican-leaning electorate. Of course, that is a point in Trump's favor. Something else I'm watching is these Republican Senate races throughout the country have closed. Most of this election cycle, the Republican challengers in open races or in incumbent races throughout the country, key states, have lagged behind Trump. That is, Trump has polled better than these Republican candidates for the Senate. That gap has disappeared in recent days in many of these elections. And that suggests to me that as people are coming closer to the election, they're beginning to say, yes, I'm going to vote one way or the other. And these Senate races, if they all tilt one way, that could be a very good night for Republicans with pickups in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, in addition to Montana and Ohio. And then, of course, the seat in West Virginia, which is essentially a gimme for Republicans, swapping Joe Manchin with Governor Jim Justice.
Do you have any predictions for the House?
The House is much harder because of this narrow margin and this entrenched division in the country. What I will say is that if you look at the toss-up races, the Democrats have to do very well among the toss-ups in order to catch a House majority. I will say also that, we overlooked the fact that in 2022, despite the election results being fairly disappointing for Republicans, Republicans won 50% of the national House vote. That, I think, again, points toward this more Republican-leaning electorate at a time where there's a desire for change. And that, of course, would be good for another Republican House as well.
Yeah, and the generic vote in the House continues to have more people favoring a Republican House, which is striking to me because that's not often a number they go into an election with. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with Matthew Continetti.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. Here we are on this final election day. One more thing that I just find fascinating because I think it's a big unknown and an uncertainty as to how things look by the end of today. People forget that one bright spot of 2020, the 2020 election, because, by the way, none of us think of that election with much joy at all. But one bright spot of it was 66.8% of citizens age 18 or older, those who are eligible to vote, did vote. 158 million people. That was the highest voter turnout since 1900. And by the way, it also equaled 94% of registered voters, which is just an eye-watering number. And in fact, if you look at 2018 and 2020 and 2022, all of those were some of the highest turnouts on record for elections of their kind, whether it be midterms or presidentials. And it almost feels like we're seeing some of that talking about this early vote. If you look at some of those early voting numbers in Pennsylvania, the number of new voters, people who did not vote in the last election, the number who have now voted already in Pennsylvania is 100,000, which is greater than the number of votes that Joe Biden won the state by. Similarly, in Arizona, the number of new voters who have already voted is nearly 90,000. That's more than 8 times the number of votes that Biden won the state by in 2020. And I'm really curious your thoughts. There's been a lot of talk about the Trump side trying to get out and target these low propensity voters, people who haven't voted in the past or don't vote frequently. But the Harris campaign has been trying to do the same. Are we going to have another just huge turnout election? And could that possibly be something that the polls are missing too?
Well, if past is prologue, we could have some major turnout. I mean, Donald Trump is a turnout machine. Since he stepped on the national stage, Americans have been engaged. They have voted in ways where they really haven't for decades. And so since he's on the ballot, and you'd expect that to carry over to this election as well. I'll say something about the early vote. Remember, in 2020, Donald Trump was not a big fan of early and absentee voting. And he has since changed his tone on the subject and has encouraged his supporters to go out and vote in person early. And I think that's helped Republicans. And so, whereas in the past, Democrats have had this advantage in the early vote, Republicans have, I think, been very competitive in the early vote in many of the swing states. And so you wonder, where will the turnout come for Harris? The Democrats have a lot of resources. She's raised a lot of money. That's one other thing that she's done well. That I forgot to mention earlier. She's raised a lot of money. And so they're going to try their hardest to mobilize their supporters, especially in some of these Hispanic and African-American neighborhoods. The enthusiasm is not what it once was for Democrat nominees. Then I think she could be in trouble.
Yeah, one other really interesting statistics that have been showing up already in that early vote is urban votes are down by comparison to 2020 as a percentage of the votes that are coming in. Rural votes are up. And that's interesting just in terms of the dynamic of the campaign. Another topic here real quick is people head to the polls, and I'm sure people would love to get your take on this. How confident should they feel this year? I mean, litigation is sadly now part of any discussion about elections. The last time around, the GOP was caught pretty flat-footed in terms of the litigation that went on and the efforts that went on that Democrats were successful in getting to sort of change the rules via COVID. So Republicans were left after the fact trying to litigate results, which they didn't do very successfully, also because it's much harder to do that. They've been very aggressive this time around in what they call election integrity, with a lot of lawyers and a lot of lawsuits. I looked at one point and it was remarkable. I think there were more than 100 ongoing election litigation cases in the battleground states alone as of a couple of weeks ago. Some things I think have gotten better since 4 years ago in ways that are helpful. I think, for instance, in Pennsylvania, the top court has just ruled on what to do with ballots that aren't dated correctly. That was something that was left up in the air and a problem after the fact. But others remain in doubt. And there's also some split decisions across the country as to how, in particular, election officials should handle, for instance, ballots that have illegible postmarks on them. All of these things that could make a difference if things were close. But if you're the average American and you feel squeamish about this, how do you think the country stands right now in terms of election integrity? And how long of a night do you think it might be, or week, or month?
I was looking at a graph recently. I think The Economist put it out, of days from election day that it took to decide presidential contests. And I realized that 2 of the longest fought presidential contests, the longest it took to reach a decision, have been during my career as a voter. So I don't know what that means. You can blame it on me, I guess. But I hope we're not in for that tonight. I'll say first, being aggressive on election integrity, I think, is important because it accompanies the decision from the Trump campaign to encourage early voting. And so this way you can have both and not either or. Say don't vote early and then we'll try to pick up the pieces after the election. This way it's vote early and we're on top of things.
Right.
And I think that's an important decision. On whether it's going to be a long night, it just really pains me that here we are, the United States of America. I think this is our 60th presidential election. We are the oldest continuous constitutional democracy in the world. And we cannot get our act together when it comes to election day.
I know.
And I think it's just a national shame. And you look overseas, and I'm not in the position as a conservative to, encourage Americans to follow the example of Europe. But I will tell you that when it comes to election administration, the Europeans, they have voter ID, they have very strict rules on absentee ballots, and they get their vote total in within the night. And you know who wins these elections. There's no reason that America can't do the same thing. And so I hope that we don't need another reminder like 2020 or like the 2000 election that dragged on for almost a month, or longer than a month, actually, to get us to be serious in places like California and Pennsylvania to get the vote counted fast. That's the key.
It's funny you should say that. I was just about to say, and shame on Pennsylvania for not, over the past 4 years, updating its archaic rules to allow, for instance, for the pre-processing of mail-in votes. I think we as a country are going to have a discussion again about the use of mail-in voting and tighten up those rules a little bit, because what we found from 2020 is it was entirely a function. Every day it dragged on as tempers began to sort of grow and the disillusion and fears about the process began to grow. So I agree with you entirely. We've got to get this sorted out. Now, if it does end up going on for more than a couple of days, what's your advice to voters? How do they numb the pain? What will you be doing?
Well, I look at all these liberal institutions and they're preparing, self-care rooms and trauma experts to be available for people who are upset at the election result. I always love that phrase from the Blitz, keep calm and carry on, and try to judge these lawsuits, if they do happen, on the merits. But we've been through a lot and we've held, and I do think that will continue this time. I will say one thing, just picking up on your excellent point. You do need both parties to be interested in getting us to a place where we can declare the winner of an election on election night. And it's just striking that we talked about Pennsylvania and how they have not really done all that's necessary. Whereas when Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia, the Republican governor, has tried to clean up the voting rolls, the Biden Justice Department sued him.
Yeah.
But luckily Youngkin won. So you need both parties. And right now, I think we have only one that's interested in getting our act together on voting.
Yes, excellent point. Well, Matthew, if it does go on a long time, I will just text you. We can send happy thoughts back and forth to each other. We wish our happy thoughts to Americans. Thank you again for coming in, and thank you to our listeners for being here this week. We'll be back next week, this time hopefully with answers about what has happened in the election. If you like the podcast, please write to us at pwpodcast.com, and we will see you soon.